I just think the church will be forced to into these decisions at some point. So it's like, do you want to get there when you're so desperate, or do you want to lead the curve, right? And even show the marketplace how to do it well. I mean, how to shepherd people well, even though they're not, within sort of arm's length, right? And so it's, I don't know. If anything, it seems like let the church lead the way in that, not perpetually lag behind, you know?
Today's interview is going to be with Stephen Bush. He is our CEO and co-founder, and I love this interview because we're going to get down to the nitty-gritty of HR, and it might not seem like, hey, that's something that I should be super interested in, but if you're living in California, if you're a ministry leader around the globe, we have some really cool things for you that are going to help you get practical with the tactical today.
Welcome to the Kingdom One podcast, where we grow the church together. This podcast is here to give you big ideas and help you get practical with the tactical. Here's your host, Nick Ovalle.
Well, hey everybody, welcome to the first ever Kingdom One podcast. My name is Nick Ovalle. I am your host today, and we have a special treat for you. We are hearing from our founder, our CEO, Stephen Bush. He has an MBA with an emphasis in HR, SHRM SCP certification, and started in human resources at Target, worked at Blizzard Activision, which is way, way cool, and is currently at the High Desert Church in Victorville, California as a business administrator. And the reason you're listening to this podcast is because Stephen Bush is our founder. He's our CEO here at Kingdom One, and you can follow him on the Instagram at Stephen_Kingdom One. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Nick. I'm excited to be here. This is fun.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so glad we get to hang out together. Every time that we hang out, I feel that we have a lot of fun. We really jive, and so appreciate you taking the time.
Totally, man.
You have a really, really cool, set of places that you've worked, set of skills. I would really love to hear about your time at Activision. Can you possibly talk about that? Because I'm just a nerd in general, but when I hear about working at one of the largest software companies, video game companies, that's really exciting.
Yeah, Activision was super, super fun. I worked in the corporate offices in Santa Monica, so it was kind of the hub of where everything took place. I got to work with a really incredible team. I had an incredible boss. I was HR for HR. I don't know if you can get any more nerdy HR than that. I got to work with the chief legal officer of the company and all of the attorneys, paralegals. I worked with the chief talent and strategy officer of the company, who was sort of like the head honcho of HR as well as corporate strategy. And it was super fun. It was very challenging, very fast paced. The scope was really complex. I got to work with people all around the world: Shanghai, Dublin, New York, and so it was super, super fun.
That's really, really cool. You told me a story one time, and it was like a cultural story of Blizzard Activision is kind of in two different entities, but they all sit under one roof. You told me about going to a meeting. Can you talk to our audience today and talk about that meeting and how it shaped some of your beliefs around culture, and specifically in the HR space?
In my role as HR for HR, and kind of just how my personality is wired, there was almost a sense sometimes of like, hey, Blizzard, for example, really wants to have a lot of autonomy. We don't want to engage a whole lot with Activision Blizzard, the parent sort of company. And so, let them do their thing. We'll do our thing. When we have to talk, we will. And I love building bridges. And so I remember calling my counterpart there, who was HR for HR at Blizzard, which is kind of interesting, and just saying, hey, do you want to be friends? And she was like, sure. Do you want to be friends? Like, are we allowed to be friends? And so we began having regular conversations where I would say, hey, let me pick your brain. Like, here's some strategies I'm deploying in my role. Are you doing something similar where you're at? And that friendship really kind of built up to the point where I said, can I come visit you at Blizzard? Mind you, I worked in Santa Monica. She worked in Irvine. And so she said, yeah, come on down. So I showed up at Blizzard, and one of the things on our agenda was I wanted to observe how they do orientation at Blizzard. And, we did orientation at 3100 in Santa Monica. And so I got to sit in the orientation, And one of the head honchos at Blizzard was giving the orientation and caught wind that I was there. Remember, I'm an Activision Blizzard employee. I'm from corporate, right? And so he kind of called me out and said, "Hey, I heard that there's somebody from corporate here. Can you raise your hand, whoever that is?" So I raised my hand, and everybody turns around, and he kind of says, like, "What are you doing here?" And I laughed a little bit because I'm like, we're all the same company. Like, why is that even a question? But he was like, seriously, like, are you here from corporate? Are you kind of keeping an eye on us? You're from the parent company, so to speak, to see what we're up to. And I said, man, I'm passionate about learning. I'm passionate about advancing, what we're trying to do. And so I'm building a relationship with my counterpart here, and I'm just getting to observe. And so he kind of said, okay, fine. You can stay today. But it just struck me. I was like, man, we're all kind of playing for the same team, yet there is a little bit of suspicion of, what am I doing here from Santa Monica? I'm kind of coming out of my space, and I'm invading a little bit the Blizzard space. So anyway, it was just kind of a funny experience.
Yeah, one thing I've noticed about you is that you can build a relationship with anybody, even in some of the most quote unquote like hostile or maybe not the most friendly spaces. So I really like that, and I felt that that story in particular for me makes a lot of sense when we start talking about this new paradigm of work. You've created within Kingdom One something that I find really, really unique. But I think that also speaks to the culture aspect that, that there are really no silos. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to knock down silos between churches and working together. And so that story of Activision Blizzard and, the hostility, quote unquote, that's there, but also this idea that we can build bridges and we're bridge builders. So as we talk about this new paradigm of working, can you talk to us a bit about the structure of Kingdom One? It's something that's really unique, and it probably started as, like, honestly, out of a problem that is in California with some California laws. Would you mind walking us through that and why this is very unique?
Yeah, and if it's okay too, I want to touch a little bit on what you just said, Nick, because I think it's really important. I still, man, just marvel a little bit at sometimes just to see how the Lord works, right? And so I think even my time at Activision was very interesting, as it sort of has shaped a little bit about how Kingdom One is approaching solving problems. And so that example I gave you of, kind of three different companies, it's all within one, working together, but at the same time suspicious of one another. In a lot of ways, that's how the capital C church works, right? Like, there's other churches, maybe in our same neighborhood, our same community, and we don't necessarily do the best job coming together to say, how can we advance our mission? Doesn't mean that we're unfriendly with one another, but there's periodic times when we maybe will interact. But generally speaking, it's kind of like, you stay at your corner of the community, I'll stay in mine. Let's not poach each other's staff, quote unquote. Let's not poach each other's members, and we'll just kind of occupy our corners. And so I remember when I left Activision and came to the Capital C Church, working at High Desert Church, I honestly, maybe it was just my own naivete, but I had this image in my mind of churches that shared resources, shared staff, maybe even worked together to reach their communities. And I'm not saying that doesn't happen, so please hear me. I know that's probably happening in various degrees all around the country and even the world. But really, like, the degree of organization, the degree of communication, collaboration, it really wasn't there, to be honest. And so I started thinking, like, man, this seems like a huge miss, right? Like, the capital C church, if we really aggregated all of the churches together, combined efforts, combined even to some degree what our staff is capable of doing, how would that change and tip the scales of us being able to achieve our mission, right? Which is to reach the lost, to advance the gospel, to make disciples. And so, I started building bridges myself. I started cold calling churches and just saying, do you want to be friends? And, it was funny. Some of them were like, are we allowed to? Like, what does that mean? What do you want? Why are you calling me? And I decided, honestly, I just want to be friends. I want to build bridges. And so I've built some really strong friendships and connections over the last, 5.5 years that I've been in ministry. but that in and of itself took some work, took some time, took some real focus to do that. And so, bringing it to Kingdom One, I think what Kingdom One is trying to do, Nick, is we are creating this platform for community, this movement even of churches recognizing that I don't have to do this on my own. When it comes specifically to even shared services, right? Many churches get to only have one sort of key player that needs to maybe fit a multitude of needs. So maybe they get to have one office manager, quote unquote, right? Well, that person has to be the bookkeeper, it has to be the HR person, the risk person, the legal person, the insurance expert, all of these different dimensions, the IT department. And so how can we even better educate the capital C church that that's not the construct that we have to just accept, right? That there can be a group of believers that specialize not just even in things like HR, IT, et cetera, but specialize it in the church context, right? Because there's a lot of nuances that are very different from the marketplace to the church space. And so I think Kingdom One is challenging the capital C church to think more like truly the body of Christ, and not just sort of all these local churches, which are great, really trying to reach the community, but recognizing there's a greater body that they can access. And through that, they can better reach their local communities. And so I think that's what Kingdom One is trying to drive.
Yeah, that's fantastic. As we talk about partnering, and one of the hearts the heart that you have for the capital C church is to see it come together, but to build friendships and bridges. And I think that story from Activision shows that story of you just cold calling other churches shows that as well. I think we're going to get into the nuts and the bolts of how Kingdom One works in a minute, but I did want to ask you this. What would you say to that pastor or to that ministry leader who hasn't started their organization yet, or is maybe at a ground level where we work a lot in the shared services spaces, and maybe they have no idea of how to get started in that? What would be your encouragement to them? What would be one of the first things that they can do to see some real practical traction today?
Yeah, I think for that pastor that is just starting out, or that church plant that's just beginning, I think the foundation that you build your church on, obviously theologically, that's really, really important. But in conjunction with that, how you are laying the foundation for the beginnings of your culture, laying the foundations of the beginning of how you're going to raise up teams, how you're going to raise up leaders, how you're going to create the ecosystem for many years to come. And I think sometimes we forget the power of what micro decisions lead ultimately to when it comes to the big decisions, and how that even influences future years of ministry based on what we're doing today. And so I think I would really say maybe one or two things. One, being aware of that, I think is really the first step. But number two, what do you do with that awareness? And I think that's where Christ has called us to live and operate in community, right? And so if you are saying, man, I'm going to take kind of some core group of friends and go, plant a church, and we're going to do our thing, I think that's great. But I think where you can have connections with other churches, man, can Kingdom One even be a source of community for you? Because you're going to need encouragement, you're going to need support, and you're going to need maybe even sometimes a little bit of refuge when you come under fire, right? And so I know I've had conversations with many pastors now, and just even sharing a meal and saying, man, what's keeping you up at night? They're like, this is incredible. I can't necessarily just have this level of transparency with everybody in my church, because to some degree I gotta lead them, I gotta pour into them. And so to have somebody that I can just open up with, that's outside of sort of my congregation, but still very much sharing the same mission, and that can come alongside me and not just encourage me, but also equip me. I think that's a game changer for not just the church starting out, but even the large church that's been established for some time. And so it all goes back to me, Nick, to plug into community, get sort of, in the marketplace, they call that board of directors, right? Like those different voices that sort of have different proficiencies, but all want to see you win at the end of the day. And so I think Kingdom One might begin becoming, for many pastors, sort of a seat at their table of like, man, I could use just your insights on how, and your expertise and your experience to make sure that I start this thing out right, and then it grows in a very healthy way that's both scalable, sustainable, and highly effective.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing or two things that I heard from that is that culture matters, and
Yeah.
that the little things that you're doing right now is going to lead to bigger results culture-wise. And the second thing is community, in that we need community to be transparent. We need community to
Yeah.
be to have some authenticity, but also for the fact that us in the shared services space understand some of the struggles that you might be facing, whether it's financially or organizationally. And so that's what I love about Kingdom One, is that question that you asked is what's keeping you up at night, is a
Yeah.
lot of times something that we lead with in order to get the conversation going. And what we find is churches are open and more willing to share what's keeping them up at night. And we both grow because of those conversations, which is fantastic. That's fantastic.
Absolutely. I think sometimes even from those conversations, Nick, come like, man, I don't know the answer to that question. Let me go and let me find the answer for you, or maybe I need to create the solution, right? Like that's been super fun. I remember having a conversation with one of the pastors that we're working with, who's become a good friend, and out of our conversation, a new talent group was born. I'm pretty sure we'll probably talk about talent groups, but we created a whole new offering of just really mentoring a up and coming executive pastor that's going to take a stop, if you will, in the business administrator seat. And so in that dialogue, we literally invented something by the end of the lunch that it was like, I need this tool. And I said, man, it doesn't even exist. And we just literally created it together. And so that's what I mean too by, I think Kingdom One's going to be a game changer in that. It's certainly helpful to have somebody that you can just open up with and kind of vent to, and they say, "Great, I heard you," and that feels good to be able to do that. But beyond that, I think what Kingdom One is actively doing is saying, "How can we equip the church? How can we create solutions if it's not within our competence or our scope? How can we go and find somebody who has those capabilities, has those resources, and then bring those people back, right, to that pastor or to the capital C church and say, hey, maybe it took us a little while, but we have solved that for you. What else is keeping you up at night? And how can we keep coming back, keep sort of the supply line of solutions, resources, relationship going, to better equip every local C, kind of lowercase c church, the local church, but for the benefit of the capital C church.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say if you're a ministry leader, if you're a pastor, you're listening and you have those tension points and you have nobody to speak to, we want to invite you to go to kingdom1.co/resources. There you can find some resources that are going to help you get really practical with the tactical when it comes to creating culture, when it comes to just the things that you need, in this season, specifically in this COVID season. I know a lot of people we don't know where we are in this season of COVID. It's actually accelerated a lot of what Kingdom One has done because we can work from anywhere. But as we talk, I want to kind of dive deep into some of the practical things. Specifically, we talk about ice cream scoops a lot, and I know that sounds like really weird. What is this church, Kingdom One, parachurch ministry? What does it have to do with ice cream? And so I want to ask you that question: why ice cream scoops? What does that mean to you?
Oh man. Well, first of all, I love ice cream. And so I could talk about ice cream all day probably. But I think the question you're asking is when the idea of Kingdom One was born, I spent, man, probably 2 years really thinking through how do we offer what we kind of call fractional services to a church in a way that makes sense to them, that's not overwhelming, in a way that's structurally possible for a parachurch, ministry to do. And there's really, to my knowledge, there's not many groups, if you will, doing what Kingdom One is doing. We're kind of pioneering a whole new way to do ministry. And so, being an ice cream lover, I thought of kind of Baskin Robbins, right? And so, what Baskin Robbins does is they have 31 flavors. And so whatever the need might be for the consumer stepping in, there's a lot of different options, right? And so what they've done, though, is they've simplified the economy and the number of choices that you have to make. There's 31 options, but you're not having to really think too heavily about, oh, okay, so vanilla costs this much. Rocky Road costs a little bit more. I guess that makes sense because there's some more ingredients go into that. But this other flavor costs a little less. So you become overwhelmed with the number of choices that you have to make, right? So what Baskin-Robbins has done is they've created this platform where all scoops are created equal, right? So vanilla costs the same as chocolate chip, as Rocky Road, etc. And then really what they're hoping that you will do when you step in there is that you will pursue more than one scoop of ice cream, right? So maybe one scoop is $1, just for easy math. The second scoop is 75 cents. And so at Kingdom One, what we do is we have talents, is what we call them. And so scoops, probably wouldn't really hold up well in the church context. And so out of Matthew 25 is the parable of the talents. And we really like that because it's kind of this biblical currency, but it's also, honestly, it's our God-given talents that we believe that that Christ has drawn us out of the marketplace, have had all of us spend time in the church space. And from that, we have these talents now, this institutional knowledge of how to operate a church from the shared services seat that we want to share with other churches. And so what we do then is we say we have our different talent groups like HR, finance, IT, Marcom, etc. One talent, culminates in about 16 hours worth of work within a month. So if you think about it, that's about a half day of support every week, generally speaking. And so what then churches can do is create their own custom support packages, if you will. We kind of operate sort of in a subscription base. And the main premise on all this, Nick, is that relationship really is the primary service that we provide, and then the competence comes second, right? So if you don't trust us, if we're not invested in you, if we don't understand what's going on in the context of your ministry, all of the advice, all of the project work, all the competence that would follow really is not as helpful, right? And so what we've tried to design ourselves to be is not just, hey, let's bid projects, and then we'll dump advice on your lap and then take off. But we're in it for the long haul with you, as long as your church needs, and we understand that the greater trust level that exists between us, the problems that you perceive that you have, but then the problems that you actually have, right? We are going to be able to delve, beneath the surface, if you will, the tip of the iceberg. Yes, we'll solve because that's what you perceive, but we'll be able to get into the deeper things, the core things that we need to help you with through that time frame of spending time together. And so we meet with churches, literally every week as part of what we do. That's kind of our first strategy, is let's have a conversation once a week. And then we can either lean into research, advice, those types of things, or actually do some of the heavy lifting for you. And so anyway, so that's the idea of scoops. We call them talents. And again, a church can say, I want 2 talents of HR, a talent of Marcom, a talent of IT. Can I do that for the next 3 months? I've got a gap on my team. Can I get, 3 talents to kind of fill the gap? And then can you guys also help me in recruiting, to backfill that gap? So it's been super fun to see churches look at kind of the flavors that are available, and over the course of time, just like kind of pick and choose whatever they need. And at the end of the day, I think what's just the kind of last thing I'll say on this is churches appreciating that all of this being under the banner of Kingdom One versus us just doing HR. Like, that's kind of my background, so it'd been very easy to just make Kingdom One all about HR, right? But to have all these different dimensions of ministry under the same banner, lending each other the same relational equity, but also being able to work together to solve whatever that problem is, or to complete that project. Churches have just been blown away. I'm like, man, I can literally have such depth of relationship with that person that I kind of began this with, and then get the benefit of their fellow colleagues, their team members, and build just as strong relationships with them as well. So it's been super fun in our first year, seeing how churches sort of approach our talents.
Yeah, agreed. I've had a wonderful time working with some of the churches, having some meetings with some nonprofits, and just hearing what they're struggling with and realizing, hey, we have the capacity to solve that for you. But what's most important, or I'd say what's more important, is that we should develop relationship. I think trust is the currency that we're dealing in at Kingdom One, and so it's great to have competency, but I think community is also very, very huge, and I love how you touched on that, how that needs to be a part of it. I have a couple of rapid fire questions for you as we come to our end here. I want to talk to you about scaling without overhead. Now, this is a time, where we have to be very careful with our resources. But can you potentially walk us through how would you scale, a church organization, being a business administrator, but maybe you don't want a lot of overhead? What are some really practical things we could do in order to achieve that?
Yeah, I think one of the things that struck me when I became a business administrator at High Desert Church is, again, I'm really more of a deep HR expert. I have an MBA, so I can flex into marketing, into finance, etc. But again, it seemed like I was kind of asked to do a Swiss Army knife role, right? Like be all these sort of different things. And I think when it comes to accessing competence, historically speaking, the church's really only option has been, because the way that church culture works is that if we want a pretty decent level of proficiency in any of these areas, like let's just say IT, for example, we need to carve out dollars for a full-time IT person. We can try to grab somebody part-time, but they're probably going to be super junior, probably somebody that's, this is their first job, or maybe they do this on the side. And so you think about scaling a church. This is where many churches are faced with the decision of, do we just go without, and in some degree, maybe even form a little bit of an agnostic mindset towards some of these different proficiencies. And so church will always probably gravitate towards, well, we need a bookkeeper over an HR person. And we know that there's probably HR things we're not doing, but we're almost in a sense just going to ignore that and be really comfortable with the fact that we're ignoring that, because we just can't afford to have a full-time bookkeeper and a full-time HR person. So I think when it comes to scaling, again, what we're hoping to solve with Kingdom One is you don't have to bring on all of these full-time people, which you would have to do, traditionally in the past. And then secondly, again, churches, when it comes to their staffs, really, most of them that I know of, they have a lot of requirements, right? Like, we want you to live in the community where, you're serving. We want you to attend our church, which is also a function of, being a staff. We want you to tithe to our church. So there's this geofence that is sort of kind of set up around your church site. And you're hoping that even if you do have the dollars, that there's somebody that has the competence within your congregation that you can attract, to be on your staff, or that you're trying to bring them in, from out of state or out of town, so to speak. So I think back to your question, Nick, how can you scale? Kingdom One, I'm hoping, can be a scaling engine for churches where maybe you're a small church and you're kind of like, well, we're ready for, maybe even an office manager. Terrific. Well, maybe we can, at Kingdom One, in a fractional way, bolt on the little other pieces that your church could really use. Maybe you only need 4 hours a week of HR work. But wouldn't you prefer that it's 4 hours of somebody that is super competent in how to perform the HR function in the church setting? I know I would, right? Maybe you need only 4 hours of IT or 4 hours of finance. And so whatever that need is, as you are incrementally growing, that's where we feel like we can fill that gap for you and help your church to continue to grow. And when the day comes that you're ready to, bring on somebody full-time in HR, you could literally turn off that HR piece with Kingdom One, and maybe there's a different proficiency that you want to begin or you want to augment a little bit. And so that's where my personal belief is that Kingdom One will be that scaling engine for the local church in a way that's never really been an option before.
Yeah, that is awesome. I think that's really fantastic that we can, help churches scale and help them scale in a way that makes a lot of sense. This was also born out of some tension pieces from California law. Can you talk about that California law and let us know how that affects churches, specifically in California, and how Kingdom One solves for things like that?
Yeah, for our churches in California, you probably have at least heard of it, but there was a law passed in September of 2019. It was called AB 5. And AB 5 really put a lot of restrictions on freelancers. And so when it came to churches being able to have sort of these gig workers, if you will, or just engaging with sort of a freelance community, AB 5 really change the dynamics of your capability to do that. And so, without getting too deep into the law, um, that really restricted a lot of independent contractors, kind of that freelance space, and cemented in a sense that either you need to bring staff on as a W two, which for many reasons, some of them I talked about culturally. We want you to, to be on our staff, you have to be a member of our church, which means you have to attend our church, which means you have to tithe to our church. Great. I live 45 minutes away, and I'm not gonna move to your location just to kind of work part time with you. So that made it very complex to engage independent contractors. But you either have to bring that person on as a W-2, or you have to work with basically another business. And that's where, again, we feel like Kingdom One, we're not a business, we're a ministry, but we're able to come alongside a church in a sense of sort of more of like a B2B relationship that meets the criterion of what AB5 in California currently is set up. Again, there's lots of groups that are trying to get exempted from that. But for the time being, that's where, again, we can really help you to stay compliant as a church. I know a lot of churches that are like, maybe we just ignore that. And so, again, I guess that's sort of up to you. But I would hope that we're protecting our witness as a church, choosing when maybe we go a little bit, a different direction from what the government's asking us to do. And that's another space that Kingdom One solves, particularly here in California, is still giving you access to that competence, giving you access to people that are able to come alongside and help your church. And what I'll say too, real quickly, Nick, is that I think a lot of kind of the independent contractors are they themselves hungry for what? For community, right? And so I could just maybe go be, an HR person and just do this on my own. But man, I'd rather do it as part of a team, right? And so we have an HR team here at Kingdom One, and getting to be able to interact with them and say, hey, at this church that I'm working with, I'm running into these issues. Like, let's all put our heads together to solve this. I'm still going to be the face of the answer, and I'm going to be the relational conduit. But we have seen many people that have, sort of been freelancers, consultants, if you will, that are all like, man, I'd much rather do this with Kingdom One and be part of a team, be part of a community, and enjoy the richness that comes from doing this together versus me just kind of doing this on my own. So I think aside from just the legal component, we're also building a community that's producing better solutions, better answers, better thoughts, even to some degree, maybe some kind of church best practices or industry standards, if you will, that I think the capital C church, thus the local church, will benefit more so from than maybe even just kind of what the gig economy was giving to the church.
Yeah, I hear community. I'm hearing tons and tons of community, and I think that is key in what we're trying to discuss. If you're a pastor, you're a ministry leader, you're working in a church, you're attending a church, and you're just seeing that you need more community, which is a thing. Always feel free to reach out to us, kingdom1.co/resources, to find out the resources that we have. My final question for you, and this is something that we've talked about quite a bit, is what's going to happen to church staffing after COVID or during this time? Because we've talked about this a bit, and we've seen some of the predictions that you've made specifically start to happen within churches. Can you talk to us about staffing specifically for churches in this time of COVID and after?
Yep. I think the first thing I'll say, Nick, is again, employment in the church space for many, many years has been very traditional. I think the marketplace has been sort of pushing new boundaries well before COVID even occurred. And the church really has stayed pretty stagnant, right? And when I say stagnant, I mean there's been a very specific culture that churches are pursuing. And I've talked about this a few times, but we want you to be a member of our church. We want you to attend our church. We want you to tithe to our church. And so, that's created sort of this geofence around a church locale. I remember, though, even in my time at Activision, the idea of working from home was really seen as like, oh, you're just taking a day off, right? And so even Activision, which is, a pretty boundary pushing, company, if you will, when I was there, almost 6 years ago, that was sort of the culture. Well, I think COVID has really shown many of these companies that were already, leaning into telework or leaning into remote work, a few things. I think number one, it has shown them that productivity really, generally speaking, does not go down when people work from home. In a lot of ways, it goes up. Studies have shown that people tend to work more when they're at home than they work less. And so as companies are paying big dollars for all of this real estate, all of these office buildings, they're recognizing like, wow, I could jettison the really expensive overhead buildings and everybody can work from home. That seems to produce more productivity, seems to produce even more engagement. And maybe I could even adopt sort of more of a hybrid approach, like come into the office once or twice, a pay period, have some real targeted meetings, and the rest of the time just be home. And so here's what I think, Nick. I think that the church space, as it looks to attract talent, and what I mean by that is the generations that are entering the workforce, the generations, even sort of your and I's age, if you will, that have experienced kind of the more traditional sense, but are now getting more of a taste of what this might look like to be able to work remotely. I think that the church will have to figure out, how do we staff for the future when expectations of workers are shifting, right? And so if we're requiring that our staff still all come to a place, we're doing a couple things. Number one, we are missing out on potential talent that could literally be 30 minutes away, but we're unwilling, without saying, hey, you have to move. And that person's like, I don't want to sell my house and buy a new house in the community that you're in, for a myriad of reasons, right? My kids go to school here, my family's here. And so many churches have said no and been very comfortable saying no to talent in that space in the past. I think pretty soon what we might see is that churches are having a more and more difficult time to recruit people, because it's coming with such high expectations of, you have to move here. And in fact, I've worked with some churches that say, we also want you to live in a specific city. And so I think the coming generations will honestly either do two things. They will just say no to that church, or they will say no to the church, right? If that is our culture. So I think churches are going to have to figure out, what are we comfortable with when it comes to how we staff our churches. And I'm not saying, you should have 100%, people that are outside of your community working within your church, but maybe there's certain roles, or there's certain departments or certain teams that you might need to have more of a comfort level with them, not necessarily being local where you are. And even those, obviously pastors and a lot of folks that are working in direct ministry, maybe even being a little bit more comfortable about sort of this hybrid work setup, where maybe there's still days that they're coming into the office, but then there's days where they're able to work from home. So that does seem like that's the new wave. And again, maybe a new way to scale for the church, not having to build as many buildings for housing, their staff, and even being able to access greater competency, greater proficiency that may be outside of that geofenced area that they've sort of drawn around wherever their particular community might be.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic that the church should be thinking about, what does the future of work look like? And I believe Kingdom One has kind of solved some of those problems for us. Stephen Bush, thank you so much for hanging out with us today. Guys, if you want to keep up with Stephen, you can follow him on Instagram at Stephen_Kingdom1. Thanks for hanging out with us today.
Thanks, Nick. Super fun.
Hey guys, thank you for listening to the Kingdom One podcast. We have some resources for you to grow your ministry. If you go to kingdomone.co/resources, we've created a couple of white papers around HR, marketing, and finance that are just going to help you get some quick wins under your belt. If you want to hit me up directly, you can email me, nick@kingdomone.co. And just being really honest with you guys, growth, it can be a bit frustrating, it can be a bit painful, but it is best done in community. And hopefully we're here for you to do that. Until next time, peace.